As I record this, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. Major shipping lines have suspended transit. Over 150 tankers are anchored outside the strait, waiting. 20% of the world's oil supply normally flows through that narrow corridor. Right now, almost none does. Iran doesn't own Saudi Arabia's oil, it doesn't own Qatari's gas, but it sits near the valve. And when you control the valve, you do not need to own what flows through it. Hold that thought, because the same logic applies to something most people usually don't think about. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces over 70% of world's cobalt, the metal inside every EV, every smartphone, every laptop. Its GDP per capita is around $650. Around 73% of its people live below the international poverty line. Meanwhile, Singapore, an island that imports its own drinking water, has a GDP per capita of roughly $68,000 to $91,000, depending on the measure. It is more than Saudi Arabia. Same planet, very different outcomes. The reason is the same in both cases. Power doesn't belong to the country that owns the resource. It belongs to whoever controls what happens next. Welcome to the second episode briefing. I'm Kanat Munjanov. This episode makes one argument. The mine is not the choke point. The refinery is. And once you see that, the map of power looks completely different. We'll do three things. First, prove the mechanism with real country cases. The second, show how China weaponized this insight and why the world cannot fix it quickly. Third, we're gonna walk through what happens next and why it matters whether you are an investor, a business owner, or just someone who drives a car and pays an electricity bill. Let's go. I want to start from just three definitions. The three definitions keep the whole episode clean. Critical minerals are materials essential to economic or national security and vulnerable to supply disruptions. The US Geological Survey recently expanded it from 50 to 60, adding copper and silicon for the first time. When governments start adding bulk metals to strategic lists, that is not paperwork. That is warning signal. Mining is not processing. Digging rock is one step. The mining is not processing. Digging rock is one step. Turning it into battery-grade chemicals, rare earth magnets, or semiconductors-grade compounds is completely different industrial capability. Industry analysts consistently show that processing accounts for the vast majority of rare earth production costs. The mining itself is a fraction of the total. The complexity is not in the rock, it is in the chemistry. Friendshoring means moving supply chains toward allied countries. It sounds clean in speeches. The question is whether it can happen at industrial scale, on time, and at a price the market can tolerate. Think of the supply chain as a funnel. At the top, mining looks global. As material moves downstream into refining, separation, and manufacturing, control narrows fast, and that is where value accumulates. Let me prove this with three constraints that should end any doubts. The three contrasts that should end any doubt. South Korea in 1960 had a GDP per capita lower than many African nations. It was agriculture-based, devoid of natural resources. Its exports in 1962 were roughly $55 million. Textile, wigs, footwear. Today, it is the sixth largest exporter in the world. Samsung, LG, Hyundai, POSCO, all built on imported raw materials, plus domestic processing. GDP per capita, $35,000. Nigeria has earned hundreds of billions from oil. Oil dominates its exports. Non-oil industry remains comparatively weak. 47% of its population lives in extreme poverty. South Korea's GDP per capita is 33 times Nigeria's. Same planet, one country built furnaces, the other sold crude. Singapore imports its drinking water, zero natural resources, GDP per capita roughly $68,000 to $91,000. Saudi Arabia sits on approximately 15 to 17 proven oil reserves. GDP per capita roughly half of Singapore's. The island with nothing is richer than the kingdom with everything. Because Singapore controls flows, refining, logistics, finance, value-added manufacturing, it doesn't own the input. It controls what happens to the input. Same resource, oil, for example. Norway, GDP per capita around $87,000, a sovereign wealth fund exceeding $2 trillion. Venezuela, on the other hand, largest proven oil reserve on Earth, 304 billion barrels. GDP per capita, roughly 4,200. 20 times less than Norway. Hyperinflation, institutional collapse. Look at Venezuela today and ask whether owning the resource is what creates wealth. It's not. Governance, institutions, and processing creates wealth. Resources without those are a curse. The DRC is the starkest warning. Over 70% of global cobalt, mineral wealth often estimated in the tens of trillions, yet approximately 75 to 80% poverty. 171st on the Human Development Index. 7 million internationally displaced. Where does the cobalt go? It goes to China. China refines it, turns it into battery chemicals, and sells it to the West. The value chain completely bypasses the country that dug it out of the ground. One summary: geology creates opportunity, processing creates leverage. Indonesia proves this thesis not just historical, it is testable. In 2014, it banned raw nickel ore exports. By 2020, the ban was fully enforced. Before the ban, $3 billion in nickel exports, virtually all ores. After the ban, $30 billion, 100% processed products. Value added soared from 1.4 to over 30 billion in 3 years. Smelters went from 2 to 44. Nickel has overtaken coal as Indonesia's main exporter. Same rock, 6 times the value. But the catch matters. 68% of that investment came from China. 82% of Indonesia's nickel exports go to China. The smelters are Indonesian by geography, but Chinese by ownership and technology. Indonesia proved that downstreaming works. It also proved that building someone else's smelters on your soil is not the same as owning the value chain. The narrow question: if processing is where the value sits, why doesn't everyone just build refineries? Because industrial reality is rude. 4 constraints. And we're going to be talking about time, economics, know-how, and logistics. Going to start from time. The International Energy Agency estimates 16 plus years from mineral discovery to production. Refineries do not appear because a minister held a press conference. Economics. Processing is energy intensive and margin sensitive. When Chinese overcapacity crushes prices, as happened with lithium in 2023 and 2024, the business case for Western refineries evaporates. Private capital needs returns. Chinese state capital needs market share. That is a asymmetric contest. Know-how. These are not generic factories. MP Material, for example, in Texas, is trying to produce 1,000 tons of rare earth magnets per year. China produces over 300,000. That is not a gap, that is a canyon. Logistics, Even if you have the mine and the refinery, you still need shipping routes. And this is where today's news makes the point better than any textbook. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively shut to Western shipping. 20% of the world's oil, 20% of global gas stranded. The Red Sea is severely disrupted through 2024 and 2025. Suez transit fell by roughly 2/3, and traffic has still not recovered fully. For the first time, both corridors have been under pressure within the same cycle. That is what choke point is. And the minerals world has the same architecture. China doesn't need to own every mine. It only needs to sit at enough valves in refineries, in separation, in magnet manufacturing. And right now it does. How China weaponized the value. And let me walk you through what has already happened in compressed form. In 2010, a fishing boat collision near disputed islands triggered a rare earth panic in Japan. Japan restructured its entire supply chain. 2023, China introduced export permits on gallium and germanium, semiconductor metals with no Western alternatives. Then it banned rare earth processing technology. Experts freezing the know-how transfer. 2024 ban on gallium. The 2024 controls expanded to antimony, then the total ban on gallium, germanium, and antimony exports to the United States. 2025, tungsten and 4 more minerals restricted, then 7 heavy rare earths, the ones with no substitute for defense. Then the big one, October 2025, China imposed extraterritorial jurisdiction. Any production or any product containing even 0.1% Chinese rare earth component now requires a Beijing export license. Every car motor, every wind turbine, every missile guidance system in the world potentially falls under Chinese licensing authority. That is not trade policy. That is a geopolitical instrument. It works because China processes over 90% of global rare earths, manufactures 94% of sintered permanent magnets, is the leading refiner in 19 out of 20 strategic minerals. And the concentration is getting worse. The top 3 refining nations share rose from 82% in 2020 to 86% in 2024. Meanwhile, the US is scrambling. Project Vault, a $12 billion stockpile, a minerals deal with Ukraine, 55 minerals, 50% revenue share. But the geological data is Soviet era, and Russia holds 70% of the minerals rich east. A strategic partnership with the DRC for copper and cobalt access, and $8.5 billion framework with Australia. Over 20 bilateral minerals agreements in 12 months. The pattern is clear. Minerals have become the new basing rights. But signing frameworks is the easy part. Building refineries is the hard part. The US now has more mineral diplomacy than downstream capacity. Deals do not process ores, furnaces do. So this is where I want to answer the question everyone should be asking. So what? What does this actually mean for real people, for real industries, for real countries? Here is what is already converging, regardless of which model any country follows. More protectionism, more stockpiling, more export controls, and tighter control over choke points. The 3 players are taking different routes, but they are all heading towards the same destination, a fragmented system where mineral access is political, not commercial. So what would happen if China tightens further? Your electric vehicle gets more expensive. The battery materials are concentrated in Chinese refineries. If those refineries slow roll export licenses, the cost hits automakers, and automakers will pass the cost over to you. The EU auto sector employs 13.8 million people. Over 100,000 job cuts have already been announced because of or as the result of Chinese pressure, EV pressure. If battery materials tighten, that number grows. Your defense gets lower. The Pentagon estimates up to 30% of its programs could face delays from rare earth shortages. The country that builds the F-35 doesn't control the magnets inside it. And US defense stockpiles cover 60 to 90 days. Chinese licenses takes 180. Your energy transition stalls. Every wind turbine, every grid upgrade, every solar investor depends on proceeds minerals. If the refining bottleneck doesn't loosen, the green transition doesn't accelerate. It decelerates, actually. So what would happen if the US goes fully protectionist? Allies get hurt first. Canada, Australia, and Latin American partners build their minerals around American market access. Tariffs on processed minerals, like 50% duty on semi-finished copper, fracture the very French shoring the US says it wants. The paradox, the country trying to break Chinese dependency ends up isolating the allies it needs to build the alternative. China fills the vacuum. Every time a Western partner feels betrayed by American tariffs, Beijing offers financing, technology, and guaranteed offtake agreements. Indonesia smelters were built with Chinese capital because Western capital wasn't there. That pattern repeats whenever the US creates a vacuum. So, if Europe doesn't move beyond targets, the one that is currently set, the costume change deepens. What I mean by that is Europe already built Chinese invested battery plants on European soil. So CATL, 7.3 billion euro Hungarian gigafactory. Envision 2 billion euro French plant. The factory is European by geography, but Chinese by capital, technology, and feedstock. If Europe's Critical Raw Materials Act stays a target document without actual refineries behind it, the dependency just changes form, it doesn't disappear. Europe lost 50% of its aluminium smelting capacity between 2018 and 2023 because it couldn't afford the electricity to run them. Writing a target to refine 40% of your own minerals by 2030 while losing your smelters because you cannot pay the energy bill is not a strategy. It's a contradiction. And the common drift is what matters most. All three players are moving towards the same behaviors: stockpiling, export control, resource nationalism, and bilateral deal that tie mineral access to security commitments. The system is fragmenting, and fragmentation means higher prices, lower lead times, more political risk, and less resilience for everyone. If you're an investor, watch processing capacity, not just any kind of announcements. If you run a business in automotive, defense, energy, or tech, your supply chain is now geopolitical variable. And if you are a citizen of any import-dependent economy, the price of your next car, your electricity, your national security is increasingly being set in refineries you have never heard of, in countries you may never visit. I always stress test my own argument. This thesis weakens if non-Chinese processing scales faster than expected. Some estimates suggest China's rare earth refining share could drop from 90 to 75% by 2028, and that is a big if. If it weakens if producing countries move downstream without swapping one dependency for another. Indonesia shows how hard that is. And it weakens if substitution technologies, sodium-ion batteries, rare earth-free magnets, advanced recycling scale from the lab to industrial production before the geopolitical pressure becomes acute. Until those things happen, the funnel holds. So let me bring this full circle. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is a conflict zone. One country sits near the Gulf. The critical mineral system has the same architecture, except the valve are refineries, separation plants, and magnet factories, and one country controlled most of them. The DRC has mineral wealth in tens of trillions and 70% poverty. Singapore has zero resources and twice the wealth of Saudi Arabia. Indonesia went from exporting raw dirt to processed nickel and multiplied value sixfold. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on earth and an economy in collapse. South Korea had nothing in the ground and became the world's sixth largest exporter. Processing accounts for the vast majority of rare earth production costs. The mining itself is a fraction of the total. What makes country powerful is not the rock under its feet, it's the furnace, the chemistry, and the factory that turns rock into something the world actually needs. And right now, one country controls most of those furnaces, and it's not the one digging the rock. Watch processing capacity, watch export controls, watch stockpiles, watch shipping routes. And as a reminder, this is educational, not investment or legal advice in any form. Thanks for listening. I'm Kanat Manjanov. This has been the second episode briefing. Until the next one.